Welcome to episode 315 of the Pharmacist Voice podcast. I'm your host, Ohio pharmacist Kim Newlove. Today, I am celebrating 5 years in podcasting. I'm so excited. It's been 5 years. It feels like it's been 5 years, so let's do the annual anniversary show. Even though I launched this podcast back in December of 2019, and it has been more than 5 years, I've only been on a weekly schedule since January 25th, 2020. So as I published this on January 31st, 2025, that was about 5 years ago. That's why I do my annual podcast anniversary show in January, late January. If you'd like to check out my first 4 podcast anniversary episodes, links to all 4 of those are in the show notes on thepharmacistvoice.com. My favorite number is 4, and this episode has 4 parts: gratitude, history, stats, and the future of this podcast. So, part 1 is gratitude, part 2 is history, part 3 is stats, and part 4 is the future of this podcast. Gratitude first, starting with family. Thank you so much to my wonderful husband, Nathan, and our 2 boys, Craig and Derek, for supporting my crazy production schedule over the last 5 years. They have heard me say some pretty wacky phrases like, "Keep it down, I have a podcast interview in like 5 minutes." Or, "Oh, that sounds like fun, but I can't. I really need to edit my podcast episode right now." Or, "I'm cooking my MP3, I'll come to bed right after that." Or, there's so many phrases, amusing phrases that I have used over the years. You'd have to be there to understand, but in conclusion, thank you so much to my understanding family, especially Craig, Derek, and Nathan, and also my extended family, like my parents and my in-laws, for all of your support over the last 5 years of my podcasting journey. Podcasting is a team sport when you have a family, so again, thank you to my family. Next up, thank you to Dr. Erin Albert, who in April 2019 suggested that I look into starting a podcast. Good call, Erin. Podcasting was right for me, and thank you so much for your support over the years. Erin has been on the show 3 times. Thank you to my podcasting coach, Dave Jackson from the School of Podcasting. With your support, I have continued to grow and learn over the whole 5 years that I've been podcasting. Thank you so much, Dave. I am so happy that we met. Thank you to my audience, both on the podcast players and YouTube. They're kind of like 2 different audiences. Each of the audiences likes their own certain types of episodes, I have come to find. So anyways, thank you so much to my audience for listening to and or watching 315 podcast episodes over the last 5 years. Thank you to my guests for being on the show. I had to cut my teeth on the interview process and being a podcast host, and I can't thank those first guests enough for saying yes and letting me find my voice, so to speak, as a host. Special thanks to my Uncle Tom and Aunt Janet, who have both been on the show. They're family, but they're also Ohio pharmacists, and they were some of my role models when I was going through pharmacy school. Now, Uncle Al, if you're listening, I would gladly interview you sometime too. Uncle Al is a retired Florida pharmacist, first licensed in Ohio and now a retired Florida pharmacist. I was very lucky to have licensed pharmacists as role models as I was growing up and going through the process of going to pharmacy school. So thank you very much, Uncle Tom and Aunt Janet, for your support. Uncle Al, come on the show anytime. Now, other than family members, I have had a very wide variety of guests. I've had mostly pharmacists, I would say, but I've also had non-pharmacists. I have had a pharmacy tech, a student, educators, a former guest's sister, a leader in a nonprofit, and so many more. I wish I could give a shout out to the more than 100 people who have been on this show. But I'll just make a blanket statement. Thank you so much. I enjoyed all of our interviews, and I hope you did too, audience and my guests. I hope everybody enjoyed the interviews. Now, at this point, since we're on the topic of guests, I just want to make a comment from my position as a podcasting coach. I started my podcast and I knew that I wanted to do solo shows and interview shows. If you are thinking of doing interview shows, may I humbly recommend that you reach out to people who look different from you or have a different background from you or come from a different geographic region from you and learn from them. You will find that there is much more that makes us similar than makes us different. I am a curious person and I love to learn. If you are curious and love to learn too, invite people of all stripes to come and be on your show. People of all stripes have been very generous with their time and have shared how they use their voices. And I so appreciate their support. Thank you so much to all of my guests. Next up, I need to thank a man named Don Baarns. Baarns, Don Baarns. Don is a voice actor, a colleague, an audio engineer, one of my mentors, and a friend. Don taught me how to use the recording software that's right in front of me right now. You can't see it because it's an audio podcast, but my recording software is known as Studio One. I recently made the jump from Studio One Artist version 5 to Studio One Pro version 7. I am recording my first solo show on this new recording software right now, and I'm a little nervous. But I just had a meetup with Don, and we got everything installed on my machine, and I'm pretty sure this is going to turn out great. Studio One has not been the easiest for me to learn, but it has been such a great tool to use. I have recorded almost 400 podcast episodes using Studio One products, and I think 3 audiobooks and hundreds of other projects. So it was worth the effort. But thank you so much, Don, for showing me the way because I could not have done this without you. Thank you, Don. I want to say thank you to my accountability buddies over the years, Laura and Lydia, my audiobook accountability buddies. I am a pharmacist by training, but I also do audiobook narration. And while I was learning the trade, the audiobook narration trade, nonfiction audiobooks, Laura and Lydia have been there for me. Laura has continued with me, even though Lydia kind of put a pause on her career to raise a family. But Laura, thank you so much for your support. And to my voiceover accountability group, Jen, Bill, Maria, and Courtney, I appreciate your support over the years. Thank you so much for listening to me talk about which podcast episode was coming out, which number, and you have been with me the whole time. Thank you so much for your support. I'd like to thank my book publisher, Publishing in Doses. I loved podcasting so much after a few years that I decided to write a book about it. So thank you so much to Dr. Janan Sarwar and Dr. Theary Chhim, my publishers at Publishing in Doses. The name of the book is Pharmacist Podcaster, a podcast planning guide for pharmacy professionals. You can find it at kimnewlove.com/podcasting. Right now, we're working on getting it on Amazon and Audible. Look for that no later than, I would say, March 1st, 2025. And along the same lines, thank you so much to Julie Walthers, my audio engineer, for the audiobook version of Pharmacist Podcaster. Julie always helps me pass ACX specs. I'm an audiobook narrator in addition to everything else that I do. And Julie always helps me pass specs and sound like a pro. Thank you so much, Julie. Now, speaking of sounding like a pro, I have a confession to make. I typically do all of my own editing and mastering for podcasting, but I have to thank Engin Hassan. Engin Hassan lives in the UK, and he is my podcast editor. I typically, like I said, do all my own stuff, but I needed help with a few episodes back in April of 2024 so I could travel around Europe with my son Derek and my sister Kelly in May of 2024. So a lot of work went into getting ready for a trip to Europe. Engin did a great job, and I don't know that I could have stayed on schedule to go to Europe and feel relaxed about it without Engin. I have a production schedule, and I like to stick to it. I have to admit, I hired an editor for a brief period of time, and anytime I have a track that I just have trouble mastering, I now go to Engin. It doesn't happen often, but when I need him, Engin is there for me. Thank you so much, Engin. As you can tell, I have no shortage of people to thank, and thank you so much to everybody unnamed. I am so sorry if I missed anyone, but I have to end this gratitude list sometime, so I'll end with my voice therapist, Megan. When I learned that I had something called muscle tension dysphonia years ago, probably in 2021, I think, I was blindsided. I knew something was not right with my voice, but I didn't know what it was called or how to fix it. If you listen to episode one of the Pharmacist Voice podcast, you can tell that I sound a lot different than I do now. Megan showed me the way, and I am still grateful. For anyone who's heard the first 100 episodes or so, you know that my voice has changed for the better over the last 5 years. I give credit to my voice therapist, Megan. It has taken breathing exercises, vocal function exercises, warm-up exercises, and, practice over time to develop the sound that you hear today and the confidence. I still have my bad days, including last week's episode, by the way, episode 314. Not my best work, but now I have mostly good days. And Megan, I think of you all the time when I'm doing my warm-ups. I thank you so much for helping me find my voice. As we wrap up the thank yous, I just want to say to anyone and everyone who has had an impact on me during my podcasting journey, thank you. Whether you liked, commented on, or shared a social media post about a podcast episode, or shared an episode with somebody, thank you so much for being part of my first 5 years in podcasting. It's been a great ride. I appreciate you. Thank you. I don't think you can say thank you enough, but we do have to move on. Now for just a tiny bit of history about the podcast. This is part 2. The Pharmacist Voice podcast has transformed. It started off as a journey-style podcast about my career transition from pharmacist to voice actor and podcast host, to becoming now a resource for anyone interested in pharmacy topics and careers, including becoming a pharmacist podcaster or a pharmacist author, or actually a pharmacist author narrator combination. That's what you call it when you write a book and you narrate the audiobook version. It's an author narrator. And what do I get out of the podcast? Just a little history lesson here. This podcast has been a powerful tool for branding, marketing, networking, and relationship building for my business and my life. I am a go-to pharmacist in audio production, and I have built a podcast audience over the last 5 years. People follow me. They know me for being a pharmacist in the audio production space. And now I'm growing a newsletter list as well. So this is probably a good time to mention that if you are not subscribed to my newsletter list, you can click the link to sign up, which is in the description for the episode on your podcast player, or in the show notes for episode 315 on thepharmacistvoice.com. Sign up today. I will send you a monthly newsletter with episode recaps, freebies, offers to work with me, any news going on in my life or my business, and more. Again, sign up today. Next up, let's talk about stats. Pharmacists love stats. We're giant nerds, so let's get into the stats. We'll do that, then we'll move on to the future of the podcast. All right, it's part 3, stats. Here's the list of the 5 stats we'll cover, then I'll reveal the numbers. Number 1 is the download numbers from the podcast players. Number 2 is the download numbers from my YouTube channel. Number 3 is the breakdown of how many solo and interview shows I've done this production year, so that's year 5, and also the total number of solo and interview shows that I've done over the life of the podcast, over 5 years. Number 4 is the number of countries that have tuned in the last 90 days, and number 5 is the top 10 countries that have listened. First up is the download numbers from the podcast players like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all the rest. According to Libsyn, which is my media host, The Pharmacist's Voice podcast has 56,791 unique downloads, which is about 1,250 downloads per month. The top episodes are my drug pronunciation episodes, and this data is as of January 28th, 2025. Which pronunciation episodes are the most popular? The semaglutide and metoprolol episodes continue to be the very most popular episodes on the podcast players. But ezetimibe, levetiracetam, adalimumab, and other pronunciation episodes are also popular. More popular than any of my interview episodes. That's it for the downloads on the podcast players. Let's move on to my second stat on the list here, and that is the download numbers from YouTube. First of all, I should probably say that I have 368 subscribers on YouTube. If you're one of them, thank you so much for subscribing. And if you haven't subscribed yet, go to YouTube and subscribe to the Pharmacist's Voice YouTube channel today. Let's get to 400 subscribers in February. As I release this, it is January 31st, 2025. So I think in the month of February, maybe I can get to 400. Let's do it together. All right, now, I am not really great with YouTube stats. Honestly, confession time here. But I do know that I started the channel about 3.5 years ago, and I have 338 videos and 24,586 views as of January 28th, 2025. As you can tell, only 315 of those 338 videos are podcast episodes. I only have 315 episodes. So what are the rest of those? Well, from time to time, I add other content. Like, for example, most recently, I posted some of the lessons from my podcasting course, which is available at kimnewlove.com/podcasting on my YouTube channel. So I am putting paid content for free on YouTube. I hope that makes sense. If you would like a sneak peek of the course, it's kind of like behind the scenes of my podcast, check that out on the Pharmacist's Voice YouTube channel. Since I have more than just podcast episodes on my YouTube channel, I don't really know how many of those 24,586 views or downloads are from podcast episodes. But for the sake of just getting through this stat, done's better than perfect, and I'll just say that I have approximately 24,000 downloads for the podcast over 3.5 years. Now, which podcast episodes do people seem to like on my YouTube channel? It's, again, the drug pronunciations. Same thing on the podcast players as on YouTube. But at a glance, the most popular ones on the YouTube channel are a little bit different from the podcast players. On the YouTube channel, people seem to like the fentanyl episode, tirzepatide, semaglutide, and mifepristone/misoprostol. So the YouTube crowd's just a little bit different from the podcast player crowd. Either way, everybody loves the drug pronunciation episodes. That does it for the YouTube numbers. Next on the list is the third stat, which is a breakdown of how many solo and interview shows I published this year 5 of the podcast, and also the cumulative total over the last 5 years. In year 5, I published 35 solo shows, including today's episode, and 19 interview shows. Total over the last 5 years, the life of the podcast, I have published 165 solo shows and 150 interview shows. Interestingly, this is the first year since year 1 of the podcast that I've had more solo shows than interview shows. Kind of interesting to look back. The fourth stat on my list is the number of countries that have listened to the Pharmacist's Voice podcast in the last 90 days. According to my media host, which again is Libsyn, and you can find them at Libsyn, Libsyn.com, the number of countries is 72. 72 countries have tuned into this podcast in the last 90 days. Are there any surprises among those 72? I'll just say that I personally found it interesting that Iceland has tuned in. There are a lot of interesting countries, especially like Estonia and the Baltic states. I'm kind of surprised to see those. Who know? You never know who's going to tune into a podcast. But hey, I would love to visit Iceland someday. I think when I was in sixth grade, I had to do a report about Iceland. Therefore, I'm kind of interested in going to Iceland someday. So I was pleasantly surprised to see Iceland on that list. Thanks for listening, Iceland, and thank you all for listening, really. All 72 countries. And, I don't go in and look throughout the year to see who's listening. I just do it for my anniversary episode. I know that people from around the world listen, but I think it's really cool that just 72 countries in just the last 90 days have tuned in. Very cool. The fifth and final stat on my list today is the top 10 countries who have listened in the last 90 days. Let's do this Letterman style, if you know what I mean, and we'll start with the number 10. Number 10 is Thailand. Number 9, the Republic of Korea, which I believe is South Korea. Number 8, France. Number 7, India. Number 6, Australia. Number 5, the United Kingdom. Number 4, Canada. Number 3, Iraq. IRAQ, Iraq. Number 2, Japan. And number 1 is the United States of America. Any surprises there? Just the countries that don't have English as their first language, I guess. I have looked at this list before and seen the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, and India at the top of the list, but you just never know who else is going to be in that top 10. This year, I also saw Japan, Iraq, France, South Korea, and Thailand. No matter which country you are tuning in from, thank you so much for listening to the Pharmacist's Voice podcast. That does it for the stats. I hope that was enough nerdy data for you. I really like looking back at all those stats. Next, let's talk about the future of this podcast. I plan to publish every week until the first week of May 2025. Then, honestly, I'm not sure what's going to happen. My older son, Craig, finishes high school during the first part of May. In the state of Ohio here, we tend to graduate our students in the first part of May. And his graduation will affect the future of the podcast. I need to keep up with my clients, podcasting, self-care, and family. So if something's got to give, it might be the podcast. What's going to happen? Well, I might go to a monthly schedule. Again, that will not be until May if I can help it. So let's just see what happens. And hey, just a little backstory. If you're new to the show, I have 2 sons, Craig and Derek, ages 21 for Craig, 19 for Derek. Derek is in college, and the older one is actually still in high school. I know this is a little bit backwards, but Craig has autism, and he's in what's called a deferred graduation program at the local high school. Craig will be transitioning to adult services whenever he graduates. But after looking for at least 18 months for those adult services, we still haven't found a good fit yet. So I may be his plan after graduation. I don't know yet. It's not for lack of trying. I have looked for the last 18 months to find a good fit. We're still looking. I'm not giving up yet. But anyways, I'm planning to switch to a monthly show until I can get Craig set up with whatever's next for him. Family first. It's kind of a tough year for my family. Transition times can be tough, and transitioning from high school to adult services is unknown territory. We have a huge transition coming up. Until the possible switch to a monthly show in May, though, I do have a production schedule. I have lots of episodes planned, so let's talk about those now. The podcast anniversary episode that you are listening to today kind of closes out year 5 of the Pharmacist's Voice podcast. Year 6 will have more drug pronunciation episodes. The Pharmacist Podcasters series will continue. I have a poison prevention episode planned for March and an Autism Awareness and Acceptance Month episode planned for April. We'll definitely be talking about transition to adult services because that is definitely on my mind. The month of May might get tricky if I cut back to once a month, But if I do continue weekly, I plan to ask Matt Grissinger, the pharmacist from ISMP, the Institutes for Safe Medication Practices, to come back for an interview about a medication safety topic of his choosing. Again, that should go into May if I do continue weekly. October's a possibility as well. I do have an empty spot in October. It happens to be Halloween, so the opening is on Halloween. Medication safety can get kind of scary, so that's why I thought maybe I'd just leave that open on Halloween. Assuming a weekly schedule, I will also bring back the Pharmacist Authors series in June, July, and August. That's always my summer project for this podcast. Again, assuming a weekly schedule, my seasonal updates will continue for winter, spring, summer, and fall. Usually the winter update is in February, spring update in May, summer update in August, and fall update in November. Now, in those seasonal updates, in case you've never listened to one, I talk about my family, my business, my podcast, and what I've been listening to, reading, watching, and playing. I love that last part the most, but I really love these episodes because if I ever want to go back and listen to what I was doing in time, I can listen to those. It's really cool. And I would also love to interview another Public Health Service commissioned core pharmacist. I really appreciate their mission, and I would love to interview another pharmacist who works for the Public Health Service. That does it for the future of this podcast. The mission of this podcast is to talk about pharmacy topics and careers, so you, my listener, feels connected to the profession of pharmacy and inspired to contribute to it. Whether you're a student, a tech, a pharmacist, a professor, a pharmacy owner, or a fan of the pharmacy profession, I hope that you will tune in for the rest of 2025 and beyond. I've got a lot of great episodes planned this year, and I look forward to continuing the Pharmacist's Voice podcast in 2025. That's all I've got for you today. Thank you so much for joining me for my 5-year podcast anniversary episode. Thanks for listening to episode 315. To read the show notes, go to thepharmacistvoice.com, click the podcast tab, and find episode 315. In the show notes, you will find links to my other 4 podcast anniversary episodes, a link to my free ebook and audiobook about podcasting, just in case you're interested in starting a podcast too, my social media links, and more. If you know someone who would like this episode or might be interested in being a guest for the Pharmacist Podcasters series or the Pharmacist Authors series, go ahead and share this episode with them. I have a link to the guest application form in the show notes. I'll also have it in the description for this episode on your podcast player. And if you like this podcast, please come on back. I've got a lot planned for 2025. Subscribe to or follow the Pharmacist's Voice podcast on your favorite podcast player and YouTube to get each new episode right when it comes out. Thanks so much for listening today. I'll talk to you next Friday.